with us this evening is the Pennsylvania Economy League. You'll recall, gosh, going back to early last spring, I guess, when we had hired the Pennsylvania Economy League for this with funding from the Department of Community and Economic Development. It's their STAMP program, Strategic Management Planning Program. And with the goal of sort of reviewing sort of all aspects of city finances, projections, all aspects of our operations, departmental wise.
So we actually looked back all the way to 2013. For presentation purposes, we use a 5-year window here. So historically, you guys have been doing fairly well. Your revenues are exceeding your expenditures. In the last 5 years, you have not, according to the audits, have not had a deficit going forward. The issue, though, is that your revenues are not keeping pace with your expenditures. While revenues grew over the period by 5.6%, expenditures grew by 8%, almost a little bit more than double. I'm sorry. The bullet point says 306. That was prior to the audit. Those were reported numbers, but the audit came in at 524 for the growth, or 5.6%. Go to the next. This is just a graphic depiction of that. You can see how the revenues are kind of staying there, and your expenditures are growing throughout the period. So where's your revenue growth? It's in non-tax revenue. Your taxes have actually decreased more and pretty much wiped out the growth in the non-tax revenues. And if it wasn't for the transfers in to the city from I believe it's mostly from the rainy day fund, you would not have seen any revenue growth at all. So you're basically flat on your revenues. Taxes. Real estate taxes, your assessments have been decreasing by 0.5%, and you can see that in the real estate tax numbers. Your earned income tax has kind of fluctuated throughout the period. I'm not really sure if that's a timing thing with your earned income tax.
I'll remind council the 2018 flush there was the major sale of Ainsworth Pet Nutrition to Smuckers, which there was a number of bonuses and things that resulted in a one-time bump in earned income tax.
Yeah, that makes sense. Other than that, you're seeing just a slight growth in earned income tax. Like from if I took out 18 and looked at 20,000, I'm looking at 40,000 over 16 to 19, or 19 to 16. Okay. If you could go back, I'm sorry. Your real estate tax base is about 70% of the taxes that come in overall, and as I said, that's kind of a declining source of revenue, so you kind of have to watch that. Okay.
You saw what Patty just said about the percentage of revenue that comes from real estate taxes. About 2/3 of your tax revenue comes from real estate taxes. That's not unusual for cities in Pennsylvania. I'm used to seeing that number, unfortunately. Property taxes are the backbone of local government in Pennsylvania, particularly cities. That's historically one of your sources of wealth. I said historically. Recently, in the last 20 years, that has not been the case. If you look at this graph, this is the market value, which indicates what the Commonwealth, every 2 years, looks at actual sales in the county. Every 2 years, they come in and look at what was sold in the county at an arm's length transaction, they call it. They run a statistical analysis, and they come up with what they say is the market value of properties in Meadville. Countywide, but in this case, we're looking at the city. So you can see that the market value, the value of properties held by people in Meadville, grew 36% over the last 20 years.
Yeah, question.
Yeah.
This growth in market value, that is all arm's length transactions, including sales to tax-exempt properties, which are ultimately taken off the rolls?
That I don't know. I don't know the interior of the formula, but it is, if it was sold at an arm's length, that's taxable market value. Okay, so if it went from a for-profit, a taxable entity to a non-taxable entity, it falls out of that.
All right.
Okay, that might be why if you're talking about a large sale, there's a dip in there. You notice the market value is flattened out. This is a good point. Taxable market value, taxable assessed value. What you're seeing here is a function of Pennsylvania real estate tax law, assessment law. According to the county assessment practices, because you can't assess on sale like you could in the early 90s and before, when you buy a property now, you inherit the property tax assessment of that property unless you make major improvements, major changes. Therefore, the city has had a flat tax base. You don't have the benefit of free tax increases when wealth increases. You are stuck with raising millages to generate more revenue of 67% of your tax revenue. So when citizens are upset that you're raising mills, you have no choice. This is the other half of your tax equation. Real estate taxes are millages set by the council, limited by state law to 30 mills, but you're free to set those, against a county set assessed valuation. 2 times 2 is 4, but if 1 is part of the equation, you need 4 on the other side to make 4. You have to raise something to balance out. So the county's assessment practices and their policies under state law. You know, this is not a condemnation of the county. This is what state law requires assessment practices in Pennsylvania. Your hands are tied on the growth of your tax base. This is an important theme to remember when you're setting your budgets. This is essentially your wealth that you can tax to provide services for. It's gone nowhere, as you can see. The next one. These are your neighbors. This is the whole county. This is the history for the last 10 years. If you remember the last 10 years, your market value has been flat. Your neighbors have had market value growth increases of 10 to 20%. The city's been less than 10%, obviously. Notice the blue in the other parts of the county, that's a 20 to 30% increase. So you've got activity in the county. Property values are rising according to SPED, the people that do the calculation for the State Tax Equalization Board. But the urban areas are not seeing the greatest growth in market value. You saw that from the chart. So that'll give you an idea what your neighbors look like now. Gary, the next one. This is assessed value change. You're decreased. The red areas fell. The taupe areas, the brown areas, they're barely up to 10%. So you can see assessment policies are affecting your whole neighborhood. So you're seeing assessment pressures, you're seeing real estate tax pressures in those areas because they're not growing. The beige areas or the yellow areas, those are growing in response to market value. So there's more development there, there's more turning over of properties into taxable properties, or maybe new construction there, more subdivisions. Whatever drives the assessment growth there is happening to their benefit. What's ever happening in your neighborhood and yourself, it's not generating growth in your tax base. That's a very important, you have to understand that. You are at the mercy of the wealth you're able to tax. Go ahead, you want the rate?
With your tax rates, you've actually kept your tax rates the same overall since 2015. However, the amount you allocate to general purpose, which is for anything, has decreased since 2015. It's gone from 11.4 mils down to 7.2 mils. And the one thing we noticed here in your rates was that your recreation tax is more than half of your general purpose tax. So you actually, that's an odd thing. You're nowhere near your tax limit of 30 mils, which you could always raise them to, but you don't want to do that. For general purpose. For general purpose.
And that's what it was explained, was that that's a traditional method of allocating mills in Meadville. It goes back decades, that's from what we understand. You typically don't see that. You see more of an emphasis on general purpose millages, but for purposes of the tax base, it works for you. But not changing the real estate total taxes since 2015 means you lost tax revenue. You had no growth, you had a negative, because the other side of the equation fell.
Sure. Can you speak to, you mentioned that the relationship to maybe the ratio to general purpose mills to recreation mills is different here than maybe it is other places. Can you speak a little more to what you mean?
Yeah, you have recreation typically is a special fund funded by millage. In this case, the city has always reimbursed the Public Works Department and different expenses that other places would consider more general fund. So, as Patty was saying, the third class city code gives you a limit of 30 mills on general purpose. So you see you have 23 mills to go on general purpose. You don't have to dedicate to recreation that large a percentage if you don't want to.
Right.
It works for you now, but it's kind of an unusual situation. We discussed this with Andy and Gary, and it's more traditional than it is practical.
Right. And one of the things is, when you earmark the mills for recreation, they need to be used for recreation, whereas if you have them as general purpose mills, they can be used for recreation, but they can be used for any general purpose.
And you are
Explain to me
using
what recreation mills are.
Pardon?
What's a recreation mill specifically? What is that?
That would be expenses related to recreation, maintenance of grounds, upkeep, public works, things that would be allocated to that. Yeah, you do that now. You properly allocate the funds. It's just that the millage source, and I forget the special purpose limit on recreation, but the general purpose millage is generally what funds your total budget. And the special funds go into, so I'm used to seeing a recreation millage of 1 mil or less. based on your assessed valuation. And remember, all these mills are based on your $150,000 a mill. Yeah, as it was explained to us when we were going through the process, it's more tradition than it is purpose-driven. But as you go forward, you may want to just look at nomenclature and say general purpose, be general purpose.
Yeah.
You know, and recreation is recreation. It's an observation that we pointed out.
I'll interject here is that because I don't think historically councils of bodies never focused on these special purposes millage rates. It's been the total taxing mill that we focus, right?
Right.
And as I explained to the Pennsylvania Economy League on the phone, right, we get to the 11th hour, the final ordinance adopting the budget. We have had a formulate where we divide expenses, as Jerry indicated, where in the recreation millage we might allocate, as we get to that, back into that millage, we're allocating some public works maintenance expenses. We may look at that differently when we get to the budget ordinance, based on recommendations from the Economy League.
Yeah. It's a way of doing your budget.
Okay. So this just kind of benchmarks you against the other municipalities in the school district. French Creek is down there because they're in a different county, so that's why they're down on the side.
Patty, could I ask you to go back one slide?
Sure.
So I know we talked mostly about all the real estate tax millages, but the earned income rates, the resident, non-resident, local sources, can you speak by way of reminding council and the general public of what controls those, right? Council doesn't control those,
Yeah,
per se.
the earned income tax rate under 511, you are limited.
And that's
as a local-
Pennsylvania Act 511, which is the
Pennsylvania's
tax-enabling
local
one.
tax enabling
Yeah,
act.
all right. I'm just making you.
What's that?
It's lingo to you and me, but not
I know,
to the general
I already
public.
got quizzed on PERDA, so I apologize for that, right? We're good. No, in Pennsylvania, when you're in local government, you are held to the standards of the state legislature's thoughts that you need. Way back in 1965, the Pennsylvania legislature passed the Local Tax Enabling Act. The nickname is Tax Anything Act because they broadly defined the scope of powers for local governments to tax. But in their wisdom, because they granted you so much authority to tax everything that moves, right? If it doesn't move, pay it or tax it. They also limited your ability to tax certain things. The biggest one was income. They did not want to be a confiscatory vehicle where you could just go in and levy a ton of earned income tax on a class of your taxpayers and possibly reduce other taxes, et cetera. So what they did for 511 back in 65 was said, you can tax no more than 1% of your earned income, which is your W-2 wages. It's not personal income like the state does. It is W-2 earnings, okay? So at the same time, they said, hey, we're giving out tax authority. School districts also have the ability to levy 1%. In the event both districts levy 1%, you must share it. So that's your effective rate of 0.5%. You also have the ability to levy 1% on non-residents. You get to tax people that don't vote for you. That's really attractive. Except if the person lives in that town, if their town levies a tax, you don't get it, they get a credit, it goes to their town. That's that whole earned income tax thing that you're sharing. You cannot go above 0.5%. Why is that important? If you think about the growth in EIT, well, you had that fluctuation, you had that crazy bump. If you think about your personal financial situation, people's incomes grow about 1 to 1.5% on average a year. Sometimes they grow more, sometimes they grow less. That's the other side of that real estate equation. Automatically, your tax base is growing when it's taxed at earned income. So you are growing at 1.5%, but you can't change that rate. So while that's a very efficient and effective tax, because it provides more income as taxable wealth grows, you can't change the rate to offset the other losses, okay? So that's one of the problems with the local government tax structure in Pennsylvania. These rates are capped by action of things when I was 11 years old, and not in consideration for the change in Pennsylvania's economic history. If you think back, those of you that are my age, cities were the engine of growth in the neighborhood. Cities had wholesale districts. They had retail districts. One of the reasons you have realty transfer in there, that's capped. That's another tax that's capped at 1%. Per capita is the most interesting one. Cities were the source of where people lived. Per capita dollars, that's a $10 rate in 1965. The weekly average wage in 65, I want to say, was $100. That's an effective rate of 10% on a weekly wage. If you adjust it for inflation today, that per capita rate should be $75. The legislature said, nope, $10 is good enough for my father, it's good enough for you. So you get $10, and it probably costs you $9 to collect, if you stop and thought about it.
Would you explain earned income for non-resident?
Non-residents, I live in Verne Township.
Right,
Okay, I work in
Meadville.
Meadville. I make 50 grand. My employer is required to take 1% of my wages and give it to the countywide tax collector. I don't know who's the countywide tax collector here for Crawford, but they hired a countywide tax collector for earned income. That tax collector then sits down and says, okay, this money was earned in Meadville, and they have a right to this money at the rate of 1% because it's non-resident. However, the resident, the place that person actually lives, also levies that tax because chances are everybody in the area has 1% tax. They give a credit to the taxing body,
The entire amount
the
right now?
entire amount,
Okay.
and you cannot exceed that 1%. Okay? You have the ability, so there are parts of the Commonwealth where there are no income taxes. Suburban Philadelphia and northeastern Pennsylvania by the New Jersey border, New York border, up there in the opposite part of the state from where we are today. Those places have a history of no earned income tax, and some parts of Philadelphia have a history of that because Philly takes it all. The only place in Pennsylvania where non-resident taxes are effective, under Act 205, which is a pension ordinance tax, the legislature did give you the right to tax non-residents at a higher tax rate, but you have to be under the criteria for pension distress. Okay, you don't have that here, so that wasn't one of the things. Andy said you had $1.5 million MMO, so. You're not, I don't think, I haven't done the Act 205 calculation, but I don't think you're necessarily there. But that's one of the few exemptions where non-residents can be taxed.
Thank you.
So if I understood you correctly, I heard that what we would have been receiving in earned income tax would increase as people's salaries are presumably increasing.
And it does, yeah, it does.
Right. Okay. And I guess I'm looking at this page 9, this historic tax revenue, and seeing that seeing a decrease from 2015 to 2017, aside from that bump that we saw in 2018. So that's decreasing despite our per capita tax, which I imagine is our only way to know who's here, is kind of bouncing all around.
Yeah, that's all over the place, but
Yeah.
you had a loss in your tax-based wealth from either plant closures, industry closures.
So folks are just making less money.
People were making
What
less
that
money
means.
in there was actually less earned income.
Okay.
So whether that was a loss of jobs, a loss of actual income, that's a lot of money there. If you take that $300,000 difference and divide it by 0.5, okay, that's a lot of money. That's $60 million probably. So there was a hit to your local economy.
So basically what's happening is people with jobs are moving outside the city, and the people in the city are retiring, and that income is not taxable. That's a pretty accurate statement.
In Pennsylvania, cities typically see a decrease in the median earned income, not so much a decrease as a very, very slow growth compared to the county they're in and the state. So I don't remember, we have that in the report, but not here. It's in the demographic tracker. You will see how median household income for Meadville compares to the county and the state. Typically, cities lag behind that. It's just, cities have always been the home for wealthy, middle, and lower income. That's why you have nice architectural heritage, that's why you have working class property, and that's why you have lower rental. That's the city's history. Over the last 50 years, there's been an exodus, as Councilman said, there's been an exodus to the second-class townships. And that we'll point that out later. That exodus has exacerbated your tax base. Your tax base people have left to some extent. What they leave behind is miles of road, miles of infrastructure, things that you provided for them 50, 60 years ago. When they leave, they take their wealth with them, but they leave behind the legacy costs. And that's the struggle for all third-class cities in Pennsylvania. It's hard for citizens to understand that, and taxpayers to understand it, because they're taxed locally. The issues are global in Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Good. Right.
Okay, so if we look at your non-tax revenue, your non-tax revenues have grown 5% over the review period. The big drivers of that are your management fees, including the stormwater fee, I believe is in there, in the sewer authority, and your state aid for pension. You got a big bump in 2019 from previous years, and I believe it was that high again this year. Deb?
I think it's 566.
Yeah.
You just got your state aid?
Yeah. So these are growing, but it was a matter of, I believe you raised some of those. So you raised the stormwater fee in that period? Or
Well, we
enacted
implemented
it?
in
Implemented.
13.
Okay, so as it's gone up, or as you've been collecting it, collections are up to full speed. That's where you are there, about a 5% growth over the period. So your next one is your audited expenditures. No surprise here, public safety is one of the bigger ones, which that would be where most of the employees are, and between public safety and highway, the public works categories, highway and streets and sanitation. The general government, I believe, also includes your debt service, and that's why that's up there. Okay,
Would you define transfers out?
that's, I believe that's the debt service payment. It looks about right. Yeah. Okay. Again, the growth has been in police and general government, but I believe general government, that was, you bought some software this year? Was that your upgrades in 19? No? Oh, I'm sorry. That's debt service. General government, let me look at my notes. General government includes your debt service, which ends up to be about 25%.
That's not an unusual percentage mix, at 86% for public safety, public works. That's what the citizens expect from their government. I mean, it's labor intensive.
Okay, and then we go to the next slide. Again, personnel costs are 70% of your budget, 66.4 in 2019. And then your operating costs, contractor services, supplies, and stuff like that is in there. And then your debt service over the past has increased by 400,000, almost 400,000, or 72% from 15 to 19. You did several refinancings within that period. So how do you compare to everybody else? This is Crawford County. There we go, that one.
There you go.
So Meadville is the first column here. They spend more of their money, you guys spend more of your money on policing services. Titusville also is policing services, whereas the townships, if you look out to the second class townships, which is the last column there, they spend their money on roads.
And the key is small, but orange is police expenditures, and yellow, a little easier to see, that's the highways and streets.
And that's your basic division in local government in Pennsylvania. If this was a revenue by category, Titusville, Meadville, you would have that 67% split real estate taxes and 20% for earned income tax. I will bet you $1 if this graph had plotted the revenue for second-class townships, you would see their EIT over 50%. And the property tax is lower, and that's the trend in second-class townships. They have wealth from migration into their townships. People take their wealth when they move, and they also build new homes in subdivision development, which triggers assessment growth, as you saw in the other graph. So this is where you live. You live in a city, and this is your distribution of expenses. People expect you to have as much police protection as snow removal. Second-class townships, not so much on police. If we can get it from our neighbors, we will, but not so much. But we want roads repaired and cleaned.
Which blue is which? Is the blue at the bottom, is that general government, or is that
Yes.
debt service?
No, that's general government.
Okay, thank you.
Is the highway and streets in this graph inclusive of our public works and some general government expenditures as they're listed out on 17? So I guess where they're reported out, it looks like, right, police is the highest expenditure, followed by general government and then public works, but the graph reflects it a little differently.
Yes, I'm trying to think. This was based on the DCED reporting. So it,
Right, yeah. To maintain comparability, this is based on your reported AFR to DCED, and they categorize things a little bit differently than we do on department and you do on your budget, but that's generated by the city. So we had to use the county-wide data from DCED. Otherwise, you couldn't do Titusville the rest of the county.
right.
But there's always category problems with the DCE data. They aggregate it differently.
Right.
But representatively, it's accurate.
Yeah, and it would include, I believe this does include your liquid fuels money that comes in that you spend on streets as well. This is why Meadville spends more on, one of the reasons Meadville spends more on police. The blue areas are municipalities that have police forces. So as a city, Meadville has to have a full-time police department. Now, it looks like Vernon Township and Westmead have police departments as well. However, from what I understand, they are not full-time police. And Meadville has been backing them up through mutual aid lately. And then I just wanted to point out, we also have in there where the Crawford County Correctional Facility is. But you can see Titusville, it's like Titusville and the boroughs that are there, they're the older center of urban centers, so they tend to have police forces, whereas the townships rely on state police coverage. And there is a state police barracks over in Vernon Township.
Correct.
And Meadville also does, including backing up Vernon and West Mead, they do also back up the state police if necessary.
It's not a fair trade. State police, it's not an equivalence, state police and local police. State police coverage is just response at some point. They don't enforce local ordinances. They don't have to be on call. If there's 2 cars in the county on duty, you're going to wait. But that's the default police protection in Pennsylvania. If you don't have a local police department, the state police must provide police coverage. I wouldn't stretch it to protection. Meadville, Titusville, the other boroughs that have it, the townships that have it, that's law enforcement proactive, that's law enforcement prevention, and it's also response. You're giving the citizens a better value of services than the townships, except the other side of the equation is they have the wealth and you don't, as far as being able to pay for this. You follow me? So this is an example where regionalization would be effective with local leadership. You already have areas where we want police. That should be a cooperative area. Where the blues meet should be cooperative. You're not going to get much cooperation in the yellow areas. But those blue areas, in the future, you may see a push towards regional provision or contracting of services from the city to the townships. But they have the same expense pressures you do, your neighboring townships on police.
Jerry, it's a third-class city code that requires the city of Meadville to have a full-time police department.
Well, let me put it this way. There is no requirement to have a police department, except for second class A and second class and first. So that's Philly, Scranton, and Pittsburgh. The default police protection, as I said, is state police. That is inadequate for urbanized areas. It's pure and simple. You can't run and enforce your local ordinances, your local laws in a densely populated area using state police. Over time, remember the old days when cities were the hub of commerce and you had money and you were the wealthy part of Crawford County, you were where all the growth was occurring, you had to have a police department to function as a city, okay? You simply have legacy costs now for that police department. No one would say a city should turn the keys over to the state police. But that's a reality you live with. And that has to go into your budget factors. That has to go, the citizens have to understand that. The public has to realize, elected officials know it. You have certain things you are providing that you will provide into the future. The question is, can you provide them the most effective and efficient way into the future? And oftentimes that means talking to your neighbors. That means a regionalization of the cop. The tax base is regionalized for the school district. Think about it. School district gets property tax for everybody in the school district. They get earned income from everybody in the school district. The county gets property taxes for all the development in the county. I challenge you to call the school district police department and see how long they come. They share half of your wealth. Call the county police department and see when they show up. You provide the basic services, but you have the least ability to pay mounting costs. That's the dilemma of third-class cities. I'm normally a happy guy. But it's important for the citizens and everyone to understand the pressures that you have at budget time. It's way too easy to reflexively say, cut expenses, waste and fraud. But quite frankly, the only effective government, in my view, is local government, where dollar after dollar goes in and services after services come out. There's very little loss in the machine, if you know what I'm saying.
Okay, so for our projection assumptions, we were working from the 2020 budget for the baseline. We never assume that you are going to raise tax rates or fees, so they remain at your 2020 levels. Your real estate tax revenue, going forward, we reduced about 0.2% based on the assessment history. Earned income tax, across the Commonwealth, we see like about a 1.25% increase, and local services 0.1%. That may sound like a lot. That's $480 adding to your base there. Your refuse, over the past couple of years, we've seen a slight decrease, so we decreased those going forward. And your state aid, we left it at the 2020 levels. Previously, we had been growing this revenue stream. It had increased every year by about 3% per unit. But in some of our other municipalities, when they got the 2020 numbers, they were actually lower than the 2019 levels. I mean, yeah, we're in 2020. We're in 2020.
Leanne?
And here's the big kicker in your revenue projection.
Hold on.
I'm sorry.
Yes, question. Do your projections factor that we are migrating toward defined contribution pensions as opposed to defined benefit? Is that in your assumptions?
What do you mean by migrating? You're required to provide a defined benefit to the police.
No.
No.
No, what do you?
All three of our pension plans are defined, all new hires.
Oh, you
defined
negotiate new
contribution.
hires to defined contribution and.
Right, so that's my question. Is this factored into your assumptions that we are transferring, transitioning away from defined benefit to defined contribution? Well, your pension expense grows at your payroll rate.
Right.
The state aid is dependent on number of employees you have times the value that the state puts on that. Non-uniform is one and uniform are two times. We got a notice in September that the state unit aid went down. I think you did too.
Yeah.
I forget if it's 3,000 or 4,000. It fell for the first time in years.
Yeah.
And that's a function of the math behind the revenue behind it, the revenue fell. So yeah, if you are at a defined contribution percentage and it's reflected in the gross pension numbers, yes, it's grown, it's in there.
Yeah.
But
And
we grow it at the rate of your payroll because
Right.
you usually have a share of payroll goes into defined contribution.
Right.
Okay, I'm just thinking it's going to have an effect on minimum municipal obligation as we transition away. It will, but it's, the
But
transition is beyond
it would actually probably be a shift, because you would still have to, like your MMO may go down, but you're going to have pension costs.
We have fixed contributions on the city and on the employees, right?
Right.
Right, but your amortization on that defined benefit is probably out 20 or 30 years, and I don't know when the lines are going to cross. It's a good policy what you did, okay? What you've done is very forward-looking, very proactive, but it's a very slow switch. But it's always better to start a slow journey than not start.
And I think to your point, Patty, right, the time horizon there, we're looking at projections, right, where.
Right.
5 years,
Yeah.
you're not going to see, in my experience, that defined. If we were talking the projection line for 20 years, yeah.
I mean, we're 5 years into that curve, but it's a slow curve.
Well, how many employees are still defined benefit versus how many defined contribution? That'll tell you your progress. When that flips,
Right.
So at this point, when we prepared these projections, we did not factor in COVID at this time because we're not quite sure what's.
I'll just
going
note
on.
for accountant, the rental income
Oh, I'm sorry.
reduction, right, that was this building, that was the Ainsworth lease
Oh,
of
it is
this building.
Okay, we were wondering that as we drove in. We're like, oh, this must be the building.
we went through the building, we lost the income, we knew we lost the income.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this vacant one.
Yeah.
It's a nice place to live in.
Good space for meeting.
Yeah, it's a nice place.
Tell everyone you don't.
Yeah, that will be you'll see that's a kind of a big hit to your projections going out. On the personnel side, we looked at the contracts, and while those might not look like your contracted increases, you got to figure in step movement and longevity, so we have those figured in. We increased your healthcare costs by about 5.5% was the latest projections we had on that. We don't lay off anybody. We assume the employee counts and service provisions will stay at 2020 levels. And then the other expenditures, we grew by a little bit less than 2% going forward based on the consumer, or the core personal consumer index as of June. And your debt services per your amortization schedules.
And assumes no new debt.
No, no, no.
Assumes no new debt at this point. And I think I got all the 2020 debt in there. Okay, so going forward, the 98,000 is what you were, I believe, assuming you were going to balance your budget with using your rainy day fund. I usually try and exclude those numbers from your revenues to see what the operations are and how they're doing. So currently, we have you going from a 98% or $98,000 deficit this year, all the way up to over $1 million by 2024. Again, your revenues are going nowhere. They're actually declining slightly because, again, we have real estate taxes declining by 0.2% over the next 5 years, and no real increases in the management fees or in the non-tax revenues. And we do have the hit for. You can see the jump down in 2021 for the rental income that's no longer in there.
This assumes no real estate tax increases. That's how it's a baseline. This assumes if things are unchanged in 5 years, expenditure side, revenue side, changes occur on both sides. You're headed for a 10% deficit.
So
The
this
good
is,
news is you have 5 years to work through that.
right. So again, there's minimal growth in taxes. I believe it was, when I got into the details, it was earned income tax only grew by about 52,000, where real estate taxes decreased by 27,000. So that's, you have a loss there. The big hit, again, the rental income that you're not going to get. Most other revenue sources are flat. Expenditures. Again, personnel accounts for 70% of your operating costs. They're going to continue to grow. You have contracts in place and healthcare increases. They are going to just continue to grow. There's not, other than, again, we don't show any furloughs here or layoffs. Or we assume that your budget or your personnel complement will stay the same as it is in 2020. Oh, and your pension, I did look at your pension, I have a note here. Your pension is at 83% funded as of the latest Auditor General's report.
That could be a function of your switch too, because you're not adding to the liability side by new employees. That's a minimally distressed. And as a policy issue, I don't know that cities want to be 100% funded on their pensions, but that's a good level to be at, 83%. That's minimally distressed, and that's good territory.
Again, the departments, police is your biggest expense, followed by general government, which includes the debt service, and then public works and fire. And you see wherever there's employees, you're going to have a pretty decent increase in the expenditure parts. So here's the summary graphically. And as we said, they're going to increase the deficits over, up to almost $1.1 million in 2024. That's if nothing changes. We always look at these as, we call them the ghost of Christmas future. If you do nothing to change your trajectory, this is kind of where we see you going over the next several years. Cumulatively, that's $3.2 million over the next 5 years. So what does that mean? Here's the next slide. This is our, you have a fund balance as of the end of 19. I believe it was $1.8 million. That was your cash balance was $1.8 million. Your fund balance is $1.6 million. If you continue to go with these deficits, you're looking at, by the middle, sometime in 2022, you're going to run out of cash if nothing changes.
You'll exhaust your fund balance.
You'll exhaust your
You'll
fund
have
balance.
no choice but to cut expenses, borrow money, or raise taxes.
That's
So,
the general fund?
collectively.
The general.
Right. Okay. So, other things. This is your long-term debt, and as of, we believe as of June 30th, you had about 34 million in, or I'm sorry, yeah, I believe that's about 34 million in general purpose debt, just under 675 in parking. But then you also guarantee debt at the sewer and the water authority, which they've been good. Their revenues and expenses are good. They haven't missed any payments, and they actually pay a fee for that.
Yeah, that's common.
Right. But one thing to keep in mind is this is general obligation debt of the city. If for some reason they couldn't pay their debt, the city would be on the hook for that debt.
To the full faith and credit of the city. That means you've pledged to bondholders, if something happens at one of your authorities, you will step in and raise taxes in addition to the fees to pay the debt.
But at the present time, MASA and MAWA loans are essentially self-liquidating.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, that's a very important point.
That is.
It's a very
Yes, they
important
are.
point. It's a prudent thing to do to back the authorities' debt because it lowers their cost of borrowing, which translates to lower fees for the citizens. But it also translates into a parent co-signing a loan. You are the parent of the authorities. So it is your responsibility to make sure the authorities are managed properly because you have a direct financial responsibility to their operation.
So over the next several years, you got some savings in debt service this year and next year for total debt service, but then you're pretty much steady through 2030, I believe that is.
Yep.
And then you have a couple of balloon payments that are going to come in here. So this is kind of your long-term look at your debt payments over the next several years.
And I think you're at about 15% overall, if I remember, on debt. Is that payment, the city direct debt payment is about 15% or so of expenditures
I think that's in total.
in total?
It's 1.5 versus $10 million of
Yeah,
debt.
yeah.
So you're at that cusp where you're skating at the 20% is high. So I don't know, Andy, how you guys have you have a credit rating, obviously, and, but be careful in the future when you need to have revenue. Borrowing is a last resort in my book. You're the elected officials, you understand what has to be done, but you are at a percentage that is manageable and tolerable, but you're getting on the high end.
And the other thing we noticed within the capital purchases are mostly funded by debt, correct? You're not putting aside,
No.
Even with those projections we have going out, that's not reinvesting in the capital needs of the city. That's mostly been funded through the debt.
Yeah, so I mean, as a reminder to council, right, for multiple decades, 2 decades at least, we've been, every police cruiser, every street paving improvement is all debt funded.
That's a reflection of the slow decay of your tax base. And you can liken that to your personal finances. If you don't have savings, you're financing. And unlike your personal finances, you can't defer and put off replacement of critical equipment. You just can't do it. So you've got to work with the tools at your disposal. It's where you're at. One of the recommendations in the report is to examine the home rule form of government. That has almost become a standard recommendation in these reports simply because the constraints I outlined for you.
What is the home rule form of government, Jerry?
Home rule, okay, I'll give you a little history lesson. When the Constitution was amended in 1968 and 69, the legislature recognized that this is back in 1969, remember, when the tax law was only 4 or 5 years old. The legislature realized that Pennsylvania is so diverse, such a different state, that maybe legislation enacted in Harrisburg wouldn't work everywhere. Maybe locals needed some ability to craft their own form of government. In the 70s, there was a widespread push towards home rule because the Constitution allowed it. The legislature passed enabling legislation around 1971 or 72. There was a lot of movement towards home rule, which was essentially a restructuring of local governments. I don't remember the number of how many home rules there are in Pennsylvania, but it's a fraction of the 2,500 municipalities. Since about 1995, home rule has turned into also a way to define your government structure, which is important, for council, mayor, that kind of stuff. But what's equally important, it allows you to define your tax base. Because remember, the state legislature says you are only allowed a 1% EIT, of which you're only going to get half, and you're only allowed 30 mils. Make it work. Okay, plus you're only allowed $10 on it per capita. So what you're saying is, I got a tax base that's frozen in time in 1959, 1965. Home rule says, that might not work for a city. They might have changed. Things might have changed. Home rule allows you to design a form of government that gets you out of those constraints. It allows you to change your tax base mix. But it's not an easy process. You just can't vote for home rule. The citizens have to initiate it, or the council can initiate it.
Council can initiate it.
Then there's a government study commission of citizens that will look at the form of government and determine if that's the most efficient and effective form of government for our challenges. They will design, the first they have to decide whether they want it, then they decide a home rule charter. They write a charter, which is your constitution. Then the voters get to vote on it again. The voters get 2 cracks to vote. Yes, we want to study our government, and yes, we want to accept the form of government that the government study commission, we want to accept their conclusions. That's home rule. It takes about 2 years.
To your knowledge, I'm catching you unawares on this, I understand. How many home rule charter communities in Pennsylvania have entered Act 47?
Well, I will tell you the reverse. Well, I'll tell you why. I've been working on it for 27 years, which is the city of Scranton. The city of Scranton has been a home rule for 27 years. The city of Scranton is a politically, they're getting out next year. They've solved their problems. So except for that exception that proves the rule of Scranton, Altoona was in Act 47. They went to home rule to be able to beat the county at the reassessment game because they were at such caps they couldn't afford their cops and police. They went home rule to rejigger the tax base because Act 47 allows you to rejigger the tax base. That's one of the ironies. If you're more distressed, the state lets you play with your tax base mix. Okay, you're out of those constraints. Once you leave Act 47, the constraints come back on. So in order to stay out of the cage and to stay escaped, coordinators recommend home rule. City of Nanticoke was in distress status with a 60 mil tax rate, 60 was the city of Nanticoke because of the assessment practices. They went home rule out of Act 47. Monterey City Borough just passed home rule this year. They were in Act 47. Shamokin refused to do it, now they reconsider. Their citizens said, no, we don't want home rule, that's just unlimited power to the government. They dropped that, and now they're thinking about it again. Short answer is, home rule is generally a cure for the inefficient, ineffective form of government that's historically given to you.
That's what I
It's a
thought.
modernization of government.
Okay, thank you.
So, in summary, your revenue growth is flat. The loss of the rental income will impact your projections going forward. And your personnel costs, your expenditures are increasing, and a lot of that is due to personnel costs, which is about 70% of the expenditures, and those are contracted increases. And, you know, we talked about the capital investment through debt. That's the way you're getting your thing. You may want to look at starting to set aside capital going forward through, you know, start building a capital fund. And if you continue on the way you're going, your fund balance could be exhausted sooner rather than later. And you're not eligible for, you guys are good. Jerry talked about you know, what the things was the deficits, missing pension payments, not paying your payroll taxes. You guys are in good shape there.